So friends, we're going to be starting out with the next topic, that is transactions with Pardanashi woman. So the word Pardanashi woman wrongfully does not refer to Muslim woman, but rather it is a reference in the sense to the use of the parda, because we have to look at the word symbolically. The parda is first and foremost a material, a cloth which covers a woman's face, and it keeps her in seclusion from the others simply because she has the parda over her head. So again, Pardanashi woman does not refer to Muslim women, but rather it refers to women who are completely secluded from day-to-day activities. We know that there are many women who do not actually even step out of the house, or even if they step out of the house, it is only in the company of men or certain other family members. So it is not possible for her to be aware of every single transaction that takes place every day. Or if someone is trying to defraud her, or is someone trying to misrepresent, or someone's trying to take full advantage of her transaction to her, are they exploiting the transaction with her? So the transaction with Pardanashi women is not void or voidable. It's not like minors contracts. But transactions with Pardanashi women would be, you would have to satisfy the court that the woman who is transacting the contract has full knowledge or is able to fully understand the consequences of the contract if she enters into it. So how does one determine who is a Pardanashi woman? To determine who is a Pardanashi woman or transactions with Pardanashi woman, you need to understand it from a case-to-case basis. Because there may be women who engage with society on a daily basis, communicates when necessary, conducts business, talks to family members, etc. So we cannot call such a lady as a Pardanashi woman, because she has knowledge or she has the ability to take her own decisions. But then if the court believes that this woman is unaware or incapable of making decisions unless she is given all of the independent advice, then the court will treat her as a Pardanashi woman. Again, it doesn't make the transaction void, but rather you will have to prove to the court of law that this lady had complete free and independent advice and took her own decision before she entered into the contract. So the thing about Pardanashi woman is that she gets a special protection under law. She gets a special protection in the sense that a contract with her should not be an unconscionable transaction. So what is an unconscionable transaction? They're saying that it's a transaction in which a person makes an exorbitant profit out of the distress of one person by being in a dominant position. By being in a dominant position means you are in a position to control the activities of the other, and you exploit their unawareness or the relationship that you have with them, and to their distress. So this is the topic with respect to transactions with Pardanashi women and unconscionable transactions. Friends, we have completed what consideration is, and that it should be a valid and valuable consideration, what offer, acceptance, agreements, who's capable of contracting, etc. We've seen all of that. Now we're coming to legality of object. Again, section 10 says there must be a lawful object. So they're saying that a lawful object is one which must be lawful, in the sense that it must not violate any law that is in existence at this moment. So what is let's look at some illustrations. X, Y and Z enter into an agreement for dividing the gains received by them by fraud. The agreement itself is void because the object is unlawful. X promises to obtain Y an employment in government services, and Y promises to pay 5,000 1,500 rupees to X. The agreement is void as the consideration for it is unlawful. Okay, so this is what you mean by legality of object also. So friends, we've understood what is a void contract, what is a voidable contract, and what are illegal contracts. The consequences of illegal agreements is that first and foremost, illegal agreements are entirely void. No action can be brought by a party to an illegal agreement. That means if there is an evil contract, no court will enforce the same. Money paid, property transferred under illegal agreements can never be recovered. When an agreement consists of two parts, one part legal and the other part illegal, the legal part can be separated from the illegal one, and the court will enforce only the legal one. Any agreement which is a collateral to an illegal agreement is also tainted with illegality and treated as being illegal. So it's not a requirement that parties enter into only a single contract. There might even be a requirement to enter into multiple contracts that are collateral to each other, that are linked with each other. So if one contract is illegal, we have to presume that all the other contracts are also illegal. There are some exceptions to this rule, but only exceptions to the rule of recovery of money and property, not anything else. An illegal agreement is still void. It still cannot be enforced by the court of law. But what if any money was advanced or any property was advanced? So a party to an illegal agreement may sue to recover money paid or property transferred, where the transfer is not in pari delicto with the defendant. That is, in pari delicto means equally guilty. So what do you mean by this? A is induced to enter into an illegal agreement by the fraud of B. A may recover the money paid if he didn't know the contract was illegal. Okay. If the plaintiff can frame a cause of action entirely dependent on the contract. So they're saying that if the plaintiff can frame a cause of action entirely dependent of the contract, means that the plaintiff should have a specific right to claim for relief of that money or property, or where the substantial part of the illegal transaction has not been carried out and the plaintiff is truly and genuinely repentant. Next is your contracts being opposed to public policy. Now, the following agreements are what we call as agreements as being void on public policy, because policy is not exactly law, but rather it is the action of the state with respect to certain things. So every country may have certain events which may be considered as violation of public policy. So these agreements are void as being against public policy, but they are not illegal. Please remember that not all contracts which are void are illegal, but all illegal contracts are void. So any agreement in restraint of parental rights becomes void. In restraint of marriage, brokerage, or basically brokerage agreements, any agreement in restraint of personal freedom is void, and in restraint of trade. So what do you mean by restraint of parental agreements? Where an agreement where one party is forced to give up custody of the child is void. An agreement to marry or not marry particular persons is also void because it's restraint of marriage. Brokerage arrangements, all your marriage brokers, all these agreements are actually not valid. In restraint of personal freedom, where personal freedom refers to your ability to do whatever you like unless it is prohibited by law. So nobody else is allowed to come and take away your personal freedom. And restraint of trade, unless the state provides a monopoly for it, everyone has the right to exercise freedom of trade, exercise their trade freely. All agreements which are in restraint of trade is usually void. This is what we have seen earlier, especially with respect to agreements which are against public policy. Please also remember that our Constitution of India, Article 301 itself provides that every person has the freedom of trade and occupation. So not just our Article 301, even our fundamental freedoms provide us the freedom to carry on any business or trade. So any agreement which prohibits the same is actually void. But there are some exceptions to this. There is something known as a partial restraint, in the sense that the creation of negative agreements. So the courts have held that there are some negative agreements which have been considered to be valid. Whether you're looking at the case of Nordenfelt versus Maxim Nordenfelt Guns Company, or whether you are looking at the Niranjan Shankar Golikari versus Century Spinning and Manufacturing Company Limited, if you look at the terms or the facts of both the cases, you can see that in the first case, Nordenfelt case, there was a manufacturer of guns and ammunition. He sold his business to another person. But when he sold the business, there's nothing to stop him from going and starting the same business again by himself and compete with the others and continue taking away all the clients and customers. So what the seller will do is, he will promise not to manufacture the same product or the guns anywhere in the world for the next 25 years. Now this restraint was held to be reasonable because it was necessary for the protection of the company, and the contract was held to be binding. So this is what we call as non-compete agreements, or agreements where a person is not to compete with the existing business in certain situations such as sale of goodwill, etc. Now if you see Niranjan Shankar Golikari versus Century Spinning and Manufacturing Company Limited, an employee N entered into a bond with the company for 5 years. If he left before 5 years and joined anywhere else within a competitor company, he was liable for damages. Now N was imparted the necessary training, but then he left the job and joined another company. And the Supreme Court held that this restraint was necessary for the protection of the company's interest, and even the court would not refuse to enforce the same. So these kind of restraints against trade is valid. Okay, when contracts and restraint of trade are valid, as we've already seen, sale of goodwill, such as one business undertaking not to compete with the business of the other. Partners agreements. Any partner shall not carry on the business other than that of the firm while he is a partner. This is a rule which happens especially with respect to partnerships. And once a partner agrees that he will no longer be a partner of the firm, that he will not carry on business of that firm for a time within certain limits. So if there is a law firm and one of the partners leave, then he should agree not to practice law within a 50-kilometer radius for the next 3 years. So these kind of trade restrictions are valid. Trade combinations. An agreement the object of which is to regulate business and not to restrain is valid. Therefore, a business combination between traders and manufacturers not to sell their goods below a certain price, to pool profits or divide agreed proportions does not amount to restraint of trade. And lastly, negative stipulations in service agreements, where one person says, I will not be employed with your competitor's company for a certain period of time is lawful. Next is, what is a wagering agreement? Wagering agreements are what we call as betting. So betting agreements works on the assumption that there is always a winner and there is always a loser. There is a 50% chance that that one person is going to be the winner, and another 50% chance that the other one is going to lose. So the nature of this contract is always a future event and an uncertain contract. Okay, so in India, wagering agreements are generally void. Especially in Mumbai, they have declared wagering agreements to be void by virtue of the Avoiding Wagers Amendment Act of 1865. So, wagering agreements being illegal is void, but also taints all the collateral agreements to it. Restitution. When a contract becomes void, it is not to be performed by either party. But if any party has received any benefit under the contract, then he must return it to the party or make compensation of it to the other person. So the general rule is that if you benefited of any kind of contract unjustly, then you should return that money back to the person. So friends, we're starting with the next topic, that is certain relations resembling those of a contract, also known as quasi-contracts. So far we have seen what is the essential elements of a contract. We've seen there must be an offer, acceptance, a consideration, and the consideration must, the parties to the contract must be capable of contracting. There must be free consent for a valid consideration and a valid object, and specifically the contract must not be void. These are all very strict requirements for a contract. But a quasi-contract is one in which sometimes there is no elements of there is no elements of maybe an acceptance or even an offer, or certain necessary elements of a contract are not there, but the court will still enforce them as if it was a contract. So the thing is that a quasi-contract rests on the principle that no person should be allowed to enrich themselves unjustly at the expense of another person. So the purpose of quasi-contracts is that it essentially is not a contract, but in the equity of it, the court will enforce them as the same. So we look at some examples of quasi-contracts. The first one is necessaries supplied to persons who are incapable of contracting, or to anyone he is bound to support. Suit for money had and received, quantum merit, obligations of finder of lost goods, and obligation of person enjoying benefit of a non-gratuitous act. So let's look at what necessaries are. Necessaries are basically anything which are required to be given to which are required by persons for their upbringing, especially for minors and unsound persons. We have already seen the provision with respect to minors and unsound persons in the earlier provisions. So wherever necessaries are being supplied to minors or unsound mind or persons of unsound mind, then their estates or they will have to pay money for the same. Suit for money had and received. So here they are saying that the right to file a suit for the recovery of money. So the right to file a suit to recover money. Money has to be recovered over here. It may arise when the plaintiff paid money to the defendant under a mistake, in pursuance of a contract in which the consideration has failed, coercion, oppression, extortion, etc. Payment to a third party of money which someone else is bound to pay. Say for example, A's goods are attached to recover government revenue. A pays the amount to save his goods, but this amount actually has to be paid by B. Money obtained by the defendant from third parties. So when an agent has obtained commission or a fraudulent payment from a third party, the principal can recover the amount from the agent. So what do you mean by quantum merit? Quantum merit simply means reasonable remuneration. Sometimes it so happens that a contract will be entered into and a certain part of the contract would have already been performed. But then due to certain reasons, there is no longer, the contract comes to an end. So a person essentially both the parties have not performed the full nature of their contract, but some of the performance has been completed. So they're saying that where one party has performed some part of the contract and is prevented from completing it by the other party, then he has to be paid a value for whatever he has done. So, where one party has performed contract but is prevented by the other from completing it, he may sue on quantum merit for the value of that which he has done. This is the law which is actually about reasonable compensation for services if they have to be paid out. Okay? Because the general rule is, if the contract is, if there is a contract and it's not fully performed, then essentially you do not have to pay out anything for such a contract. But then here, it's a special condition where some work has already been done, so value can be recovered. The next is an obligation of finder of lost goods. So, obligation of finder of lost goods is that he has to essentially find the proper owner and put the owner back in possession of the goods. So, he is only the current owner in the sense that he is required to take care of those goods until it can be given back to the owner. But if he is incurring certain expenses in the process of taking care of those goods, then he is required to be repaid that as compensation. So say for example that I find a diamond necklace, a diamond bracelet, rings and the whole set which could be worth a lot of money. I find it in a room and nobody has come to claim it. I believe that I have taken possession of these goods and I am trying to find the owner of these lost goods. But in the process, I don't believe that it is safe if it is kept in my house. So what I do is I go and take out a bank locker and I have to pay out a deposit for the bank locker, and I keep these lost goods inside the bank locker until I can find the owner. Now the expenses that I incurred for maintaining that bank locker will have to be given back to me should the original owner come and claim the goods. And I do not have to give the goods back to that person until I am repaid the amount of money for this. And lastly, obligation of a person enjoying a non-gratuitous activity. So sometimes a person may do something voluntarily, charity, donation, etc. They are all voluntary actions. Now, voluntary actions are not to be considered as contracts. But where a person does an activity, but it is not a gratuitous activity. If he is doing it, he is expecting some kind of a compensation for it. Then in such a situation, when that person has completed that work, then he must be compensated for the work completed. How is this different from the previous provisions where, how is this different from the previous provisions? Here there is no contract in the first place. But then in the case of quantum merit, there is an existing contract, but the contract was unable to be performed. Whereas in a person enjoying a non-gratuitous act, there is no offer, there is no acceptance, but one person has gratuitously done a particular activity. So he must be repaid or compensated for the activity that is done, especially if he knows it's a non-gratuitous activity.